Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Tony Latter. He's co-founder and managing director for the Happiness Index. And in this webinar, Tony's going to be looking back at our most recent 12 months of employee engagement and happiness data, how it's changed compared to previous years, and explores what this might mean for people, teams, and their wider organizations. This is the same data that Tony presented back at our employee happiness conference a couple of weeks ago. So if you weren't able to make that, you're going to be absolutely wowed by some of the findings that Tony presented back then. Be prepared for plenty of data. Tony's got lots of examples of qualitative feedback and suggested actions that you might want to be taking to help you create a thriving workplace culture. If you're not already familiar with the Happiness Index, we help organizations to understand how their people think, feel, and behave at work, take action off the back of it, and also prove the impact of an engaged and happy workforce. Since the company was started a bit over 11 years ago, we've collected over 37 million data points globally about all of this. So we've got some brilliant data and science backing all of this up. I think before we start, Tony, if we could just move forward a couple of slides, it's a good chance for us to run a quick poll just to understand how people or some of the challenges that people might be facing. So hopefully you can see that on your screen now. And the question is, what challenges are you facing with understanding how your employees think and feel? Please select all that apply. You don't just have to select one. Select as many as apply to you. So your options are capturing their feedback, analyzing and interpreting the feedback to get useful insights, taking action off the back of it, and also proving the return on investment that your people initiatives are having. Tony, obviously you speak with a lot of our customers. I don't know if you've got any sense for the sorts of responses that you might expect to see.
Yeah, thanks, David, and hi, everyone. I think from the conversations that I've been having, naturally, lots of our customers, by the nature of what we do, they are collecting that feedback. I think the big challenge that they are finding is number one, analyzing and interpreting that data in order to find what kind of we talk about as impactful actions. There's lots of things that we could do, but what are the things that are going to have the biggest impact? And then one that's absolutely growing as a trend in most of the conversations that I'm having is how do we prove the return on investment that people initiatives are having around the business? So lots of HR directors that I'm speaking to are looking for ways to be able to demonstrate the value of what they are and their teams are delivering to the business. How can that be then linked into financial performance, turnover, less absenteeism, etc.? So they're the types of things that I'm seeing when I'm having conversations.
Yeah, Tony, I have to say, I'm just going to end the poll now, but I'm going to say you pretty much nailed that. So if I share the results, it's just over 70% of respondents have said that that's the area that one of the areas that they are struggling with. And I think that makes sense because go back a few years, if you go back to kind of COVID lockdown times, I think there was a sudden realization that people needed to be measuring and understanding how their employees were thinking and feeling because away from your workforce. You were sort of used to being able to just gauge that from walking around the warehouse or the office or wherever it was, and all of a sudden that changed. I think in this world, there is an increasing demand at board level to say, well, so what? I think HR people instinctively understand the value of a happy and engaged workforce, but
Yeah.
beyond HR, outside of the HR circles, there's the rest of the board are just trying to understand, okay, well, what difference does that make to how profitable and how effective we are as an organization? So thanks everyone for your feedback there. That's really helpful. Please do, as we go through this presentation, please do ask questions. We've got some time at the end to run through them. You should have a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So ask questions as we go, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to address those. But without further ado, Tony, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just before I move on to the bulk of today's presentation, I think what that poll shows is almost like an evolution. So when we started the company 11 years ago, just measuring and getting data was probably the biggest challenge that people were coming across. Now, what we're seeing in that poll is we're seeing the evolution of employee engagement feedback because you're now getting more into, well, how do we demonstrate the value we know we deliver back into, for example, the C-suite. So the challenge is slightly changed and evolved as time goes by, but that's what you would expect to see in a maturing market. So just coming back into the presentation today, what I'm going to run through with you is the data that we received from our cultural assessment. So the cultural assessment is a pre-built survey that we have available at the Happiness Index, which a large number of our customers take. The great thing is that it is standardized and consistent, so it allows us to do benchmarking. It also allows us to do exercises like today. The data we're going to be looking at is from the past 2 years, and as David mentioned in the opening, it's the most recent data that we have. So we had our event in June. So what we wanted to look at was data that went up to the end of May. So we're not looking at financial years here or calendar years. We're looking at data that runs from June 23 to May 24, and then June 24 to May 25, so we can get a really good comparison. One of the things that I always just mention when I do a presentation or a webinar, speak at events, is these are not our opinions or our observations at the Happiness Index, but these are the views of thousands of employees globally. Over 1.5 million pieces of data were analysed when we were putting this together during that 2-year time frame. So these are the views coming directly from employees. So in terms of the headlines, so what we can see here is we can see that the cultural assessment scores are down 6%. The employee net promoter score is down 22 points. So the score for the cultural assessment overall is a 7.6 out of 10, which is a fairly healthy score. However, it has fallen. The ENPS score of 11 has dropped from 33. What this tells us is that during this particular time, it's not a surprise really that these have dropped. We'll get into a little bit more of the detail, but when we're going through this slide and when we first start analysing, intuitively, this is kind of what we would expect to see based on our conversations with customers, based on our analysis of the market. We would have expected the cultural assessment score to drop and also the employee net promoter score to drop. What we'll do is we'll dig into a little bit about why throughout. Then let's look at happiness versus engagement. So happiness and engagement, we measure both within the cultural assessment. Lots of organizations historically have always measured engagement. We think of engagement typically around what people think and happiness about what people feel. It's incredibly important for organizations to measure both. And what we can see here is happiness has fallen by 6% and engagement by 5%. Before we kind of get too much into the detail now, I just want to give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the neuroscience that we use within our cultural assessment and within our pre-built surveys here at the Happiness Index. So everything that we do, we want it to be scientific led. So when we look at neuroscience in particular, this is what has informed what that cultural assessment is. We look at 4 different brain areas. We look at things such as the instinctive brain system that sits in the basal region of the brain, the emotional system, which is in the limbic region of the brain, the reflective brain system, which sits in the prefrontal cortex, and then the rational brain system, which sits within the cortex. Now, as individuals, we have all 4 of these. Every human would. However, some of these brain systems would tend to be a little bit more dominant. So myself, as an example, I'm one of the co-founders, but I'm the managing director of the Happiness Index. Lots of what I do on a day-to-day basis is in that rational space around things like planning, processes, systems, etc. And that's something that my brain system, that's the one that is predominant within me. But others, it will vary. And it's a good blend and a good way to kind of look and see, because my other co-founder, Matt Phelan, would be more on the instinctive side. So it gives us a really good rounded view and a really good rounded kind of overview of the way that we work and the way that we see things, and some things that we see would be different. The reason why we wanted to show you this is just to give you a bit of context, because we're going to be using some of these terms as we go through. Then when we look on the right-hand side, what we have here is we have a triangle that demonstrates our model. So on the left-hand side are the areas that are linked into happiness. So that's the instinctive and the emotional brain systems. The instinctive brain system looks at themes such as safety and freedom. The emotional brain system looks at themes such as relationships and acknowledgement. Then when we go over onto the pink side of the triangle here, that's where we're going to look at engagement. And engagement is looking at the reflective and the rational brain system. Within the reflective brain system, we're going to be looking at themes such as meaning and purpose and personal growth. And then looking at the rational brain system, we're going to be looking at areas such as clarity and enablement. So like I said, you're going to start hearing a lot of these terms as we go through when we're doing our analysis. So we saw that happiness was down. So where we started was trying to identify, well, why was happiness down? So we talked about the instinctive brain system, and that's currently down 5% in that data in our year-on-year comparison. That's being driven predominantly by a 6% fall in the safety score. And that safety was being impacted by a 9% reduction in employees' trust in their organisation. So we're operating in quite an uncertain market at the moment. If we look in particular here in the UK, inflation again has increased today. Conversations around what will that do around interest rates, with the Bank of England wanting to bring them down. Is that going to happen with inflation going up? Thinking about things such as the national insurance contributions for employers increasing. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and that creates a lot of change. Where there's a lot of change, that can then start to unsettle people, and then that has an impact on people trusting their organisation. We also saw that employees are reporting an 8% fall in the quality of their work-life balance. Now, when we kind of look at the wider economy, not just here in the UK, but globally as well, there has been a period of sustained redundancies. Lots of organisations that we work with, lots of organisations that we talk to have been going through that process. One of the key challenges around going through those processes is, what work are we going to continue to do and what work are we going to stop? Are we expecting our employees to deliver the same but with less people, with less resources? So again, that starts to become something that impacts employees' work-life balance. When we start to look at some of the comments that we receive, I'll read this one out to you, but trust in the organisation has decreased due to leavers who were given little notice of role changes or removal. It does give me concern that decisions are being made through a short-term lens. Absolutely valid for a comment like that to come through, and it's something that we do see quite often within the comment analysis. However, it's really difficult for organisations at the moment to think too far ahead. So one of the conversations that we have quite a lot with our customers is trying to get the balance right between the short term and the long term. It can be really hard to look too far ahead when you're trying to solve today's challenges. So that's something that we've been talking to organisations about being more vocal and maybe sharing a little bit more around that challenge of thinking long term versus short term, and just having that open conversation with employees. The next comment's around work-life balance. So the comment here, far too busy, doing overtime seems to be becoming normalised. This level of work is unsustainable. So this is where it's really important to start thinking about, well, are we really asking people to deliver the same levels of output, but with just less resources or less people? Are we expecting people to work longer? If people are working longer, what are we doing to try and challenge that within a business? So one of the things that we have at the Happiness Index, we have a very committed workforce. One of the challenges around that is actually making sure that people do have that work-life balance, that they're not overworking, spending their evenings working, their weekends working, etc. That's absolutely something that we are very mindful of as an organisation. Then moving on and looking at some other reasons why happiness fell, the emotional score was down 6%. So when we looked at the emotional area, that's going to be looking at things like acknowledgement, which we saw was down 10%. Also, you've got an 11% kind of employees feeling less valued. So you've got people working longer, feeling less acknowledged, and feeling less valued. And we're also seeing that people are reporting quite a big fall in being listened to. So when you add all of that up, it's not really a surprise that we are seeing the happiness score fall, the cultural assessment score fall. When we're looking at things such as people feeling less valued, it's a really bad combination where you've got people working longer hours, feeling their work-life balance is dropping, but they're doing more and not being valued for that. Also, in terms of people feeling not being feeling listened to, in a time of lots of change, that becomes really uncertain for people. And what you can see is you can see organisations retreating, not being openly communicating with their people, not kind of being on that front foot, being proactive in the communications or listening to people, trying to take on their concerns and look at how they can be addressed. So no wonder we're seeing some of these numbers really fall. Then when we're looking here at this particular comment around acknowledgement, well, given there is absolutely no acknowledgement for achieving goals, it makes me realize there's no point in even trying. So I'm sure most of us at some point in our careers have kind of felt in that way when we're not being acknowledged, when we're not getting the recognition that we feel that we should be getting for the work that we're delivering and the role that we're playing within the organization. That's naturally going to start to demotivate people. It's going to make you start to feel like you're less valued. So again, you can start to see why some of these things are becoming really big challenges for organizations across our data set. Then the comment around feeling valued. So valued and listened to by local managers, but feel ignored by those at senior level. Efforts go unrecognized. Something that we saw quite a lot within our data was that people having really, really strong relationships within their teams, feeling really valued, but at a higher level within the organization, that's dropping off. That's starting to become a bit of a concern for people. And I think that's certainly something that we have seen and have been advising our customers is trying to make more of your senior leadership staff visible, trying to make sure that you are listening, trying to make sure that that recognition is being delivered back to the employees. So this slide has a lot of words on it. I'm not going to go through it, all of it, but what we will do is we will make sure that we will share these slides with you so that you can go through this at your leisure. But what we wanted to look at is just sharing some of the things that we have been working with our customers on, trying to help them to boost their happiness. So we're looking at the 4 key areas that we've just mentioned. So the first one we're going to look at is around trust. So within that trust, it's around the senior leadership transparency and accessibility. So how can organizations create a more regular and a more structured opportunity for that direct connection between employees and senior leaders? Some of the things that we've recommended are things like Ask Me Anything sessions, meet the leader type events that can go on, where employees get that opportunity to ask questions directly. And that can be about anything. In particular, some of the things that we know our customers have been asked around are things such as business performance, the strategy, financial health of the organization. But it's really, really important for the leaders who are going through that exercise to provide really authentic and transparent answers and in sharing the news, even if it isn't positive. I think one of the things that people and organizations and leaders in particular can be accused of is being overly positive, and that doesn't sit well with employees because that won't represent what they are feeling. So I think being able to share what's happening around the business, creating an outlet for that is massively important. That will certainly help with that feeling of trust. When we're looking at things like work-life balance, here we're looking at around things like right to disconnect, workload audits. So as an example, within the happiness index, one of the things that we're looking at right now and going through is a workload audit. So when there are incredibly high levels of workload, that can lead to burnout. What you find is employees feel a pressure to work longer hours, maybe into the evenings and the weekends. So creating this right for people to disconnect allows people to have clarity on out of hours communication. If they receive something, what's the expectation, etc. That can be incredibly powerful, and it just gives people that license to then not feel like they have to respond to something that they see outside of working hours. Trying to create some cultural boundaries that empower employees to protect their personal time without fear of that being seen as being inflexible can also be really, really important. What we would suggest and what we have suggested to our customers is looking at your leadership teams. How can you get your leadership teams to take an example on this, lead by example? Be able to start to introduce that right to disconnect, getting them to use some of that language, get them talking about the flexibility that they see within their working pattern as well. That will then give license to the other employees that it is okay to do that. Then when we look at things like people being valued, what we often see is that can be linked into career pathing, that can be around compensation as well, such as pay, benefits, etc. So when we talk to customers around this, a lot of what we feel is employees who are feeling undervalued, that is often directly linked into things like career progression or pay. So think about reviewing job grading, salary bands, making those pathways really clear. Focus on the transparency behind them. Looking at things such as job roles, making sure they're accurately reflecting the roles and the responsibilities so that things, you don't get that kind of job role creep where all of a sudden extra things are being added into somebody's job role, which increases the workload. Other things that we would look at as well around that philosophy of compensation, just communicate it. It helps to manage expectations, demonstrates that there's a fair system in place. Lots of organizations at the moment may not be in a position to start thinking about salary increases. But being able to communicate that openly with employees is something that they would really value. Then coming on to employees feeling listened to. So a key phrase here that a lot of organizations that we work with and a lot of companies that I go and talk to when I go on the kind of events and around the circuit, you get lots of people talking about you said we did. However, my personal opinion is that misses a really valuable step. And it also implies that because they said something, you did something off the back of it. That doesn't necessarily happen. So the part that I tend to talk about is you said, we listened, we did. Because there are lots of things that come up that organizations aren't in a position to change right now. But that doesn't mean that you didn't hear people. So it's important to go back to those people and explain that we did hear you, explain why something may not happen, and explain why certain things did happen. That level of communication is really, really important because it makes employees feel like they're being kept informed. The more information individuals have, the higher levels of trust will develop, the more open the communication can become, creating a safer environment for people to work in and delivering that transparency. And that transparency is really, really important for building understanding and empathy within organizations. One of the things that we talked about when we were at our event recently was around level of empathy, not necessarily just from the top down, but from the bottom up as well. So, is there a higher level of empathy within organizations towards the leadership within the organization? Lots of very tough decisions are being made at the moment. Very difficult for people to kind of empathize and understand what some senior leaders are going through in an organization and some difficult conversations that they're having to have and difficult decisions that need to be made. They won't be able to have that level of empathy unless that is being shared. And that creates the transparency and builds the trust. Now we're going to move on and look at engagement and try and kind of dig into a little bit about why engagement is down. So the reflective score is down by 5%. And this is because we're seeing people reporting a drop in personal growth and there's a huge drop in meaning and purpose. So a 14% drop year on year in how meaningful people are finding their work and how purpose driven that is. So when we start to look at personal growth, what we're seeing here is a big reduction in people feeling challenged in their role. Within the current environment, it can be really natural for people to kind of retreat a little bit, not necessarily be in a growth mindset. Organizations just trying to get through and look short term rather than longer term. That naturally will start to have an impact on the kind of collective mindset of an organization. If it becomes too short term, then people start to feel like they're kind of just getting through the day. They're not thinking about how can they challenge themselves, having that growth mindset to go and deliver and push forward within their role. And then in terms of meaning and purpose, we saw a 10% reduction in how people are feeling inspired by their organizations. Again, I've mentioned it a few times, but it's really hard for people to feel inspired by their organization in the current environment where a lot of organizations are thinking quite short term. Inspiration tends to be that longer term picture. What are we working towards? What are the longer term goals of the organization? How does that individual fit within that? Does that align with their own personal views on meaning and purpose? When they become aligned, it's incredibly impactful. But when it can be a little bit more around survival rather than thriving, and a little bit more short term rather than longer term, naturally you're going to start seeing people feeling less inspired by their organizations. So, in terms of some comments that we have, I feel like I've stagnated. There is no challenge in my role, and I am bored of doing the same thing day in, day out. This happens when organizations are kind of in that survival type mode. And lots of organizations have been in that place recently, given the environment that we're currently working in. Now, when I was looking through, this one really hit home because this comment is around the values and the vision. The company's only vision appears to be percentage growth figures. This is not an inspiring target to work towards. So I know lots of organizations that will talk about their objectives, the things that they want to try and achieve this year. And they'll talk about 5% growth, 10% growth, reduce cost by X%, reduce turnover by Y%. That's not going to encourage and motivate people. It's really, really important that organizations explain the why. Think bigger picture. Try and kind of create something that's going to excite and motivate their people. And then we look at kind of like the second set of factors that have seen engagement drop. First one here, the rational score dropping by 4%, driven by lower clarity scores and lower enablement scores. So when we look specifically at clarity, there's an 8% drop in how well employees felt like they were being kept informed by their organizations. That lack of clarity means you'll get a lack of trust. You'll get a lack of efficiency because people will be asking questions, seeking information rather than focusing on their role. Explaining the why behind decisions is really, really important, and getting the right level of information flow across the business. Now, what we often see is we see information like companies at this point not sharing enough. But that doesn't mean it's got to flip flop and go the other way and overly sharing. It's just about drip feeding the right amount of communication through your organizations. You'll have a much better sense of how much information flow that may be within your own organizations. And that is absolutely different dependent on the organization. Then when we look at enablement, what we can see here is that workers have experienced a 4% drop in having access to the resources they need in order to do their job. Now, again, probably not a surprise given that lots of organizations are looking at budgets that are being monitored. That can then lead into some resources being removed. Naturally, you'll see people talking about, do we need this system? Do we need that system? How many people are using why? How valuable is it? Is there an alternative route behind that? Is there a consolidation that we can make? Say, for example, within your kind of HRIS systems, can that deliver payroll as well as our HRIS functions? So again, people looking at potentially removing some cost from their business, which can naturally lead to resources dropping. So when we're looking at the comments here, so communication is very poor. It leads to problems and creates conflict. The poor communication makes it look like something's being hidden, which leads to employees feeling anxious. I'm sure most of us can kind of recognize that comment either from our own organizations or from speaking to friends, relatives who work elsewhere. But that's why it's so important to be openly communicating, really being on that front foot with people, really kind of being proactive, even if the messages aren't particularly positive, because people will start to fill the blanks themselves. Then this final comment here is around resources. So resources are too little, and what we have are poor quality systems. So we're constantly wasting time fixing, chasing, reinventing the wheel, etc. So on a piece of paper, it might make sense to cancel a particular piece of software. You might only have 15 people in a business using that. It may be £2,000-3,000 coming out of the cost base. But what's the opportunity cost that's happening there? Yes, it's been able to save some money, but is that meaning that people are less productive? Are they having to try and find workarounds? Are they trying to find different ways of working that actually, if they were able to have kept that piece of software as an example, that would have been something that would have helped them. So some of the suggested actions to boost engagement, I've kind of been sharing some of these as we were going through, but in that area of feeling challenged, looking at things like stretched assignments can be really good. How can we get employees and new ways for employees to apply new skills, feel like they're being challenged and contribute beyond their role? Is there a way that as an organization that can be done? And there's some cross kind of team, cross department collaboration projects that could be worked on? Are there ways for employees to volunteer for assignments? Looking at ways that you could give employees control over their development, expose them to different parts of the business can be incredibly rewarding for them. Can also increase the visibility of the senior leadership. In terms of being inspired, amplifying the why is a really important element that we have been discussing with our customers. Often when organizations are talking around purpose, it can kind of feel a little bit inauthentic. It can often feel like it's marketing speech, which doesn't really resonate. So it's really important to create that internal comms strategy focused on authentic storytelling. How do you take the company's purpose and make it tangible and relatable? How can you share impact stories from your customers that are going to have a positive impact on your people? Start to think of ways in which you can kind of provide some purpose and explain the purpose behind the goals you're setting. So rather than we want to achieve 5-10% growth, talking around so that what's the bit that comes after that? We want to achieve this so that we can invest in R&D to help even more people, or so that we can introduce a new product range. Bringing that why through massively changes how people would see that objective. Then in terms of being kept informed, so things like a comms charter and a change management framework are really important. That doesn't exist in lots of organizations, and with so much change happening, looking at ways in which there is a consistent way of describing what changes have been made, why have they been made, who's going to be impacted, how is that going to be communicated, that can be incredibly impactful. When there's a lot of change, as we talked about earlier, that can create what we call like a grapevine effect. The rumors will start. And if organizations create a space with a lack of communication, it's very natural, it's human nature that people will start to fill that gap. And that narrative may be correct, it may not be correct, but the company is not in control of that narrative. So it's really, really important for organizations to be proactive with their communication. Then when we look at access to resources, are there ways in which we can look at cross-functional resources? What audits do different departments have? Could that be shared with others? What's your resource request process? Yes, at the moment, lots of people are looking at budgets, but actually, is there a small amount of money, a discretionary team budget that could be given to a team leader? A pre-approved budget for low-cost items that could be really high impact. These are the types of things that could be very meaningful. When we get into the employee net promoter score, so it's one of the questions within the cultural assessment. So what we're seeing is employees are experiencing what we would call a conditional experience. So what we are finding, there's really strong pockets of positive culture. You'll find really supportive teams, people being appreciated. There'll be some flexible working patterns in place. They're often overshadowed by more significant concerns. That might be about workload, pay, inconsistent management. So that conditional recommendation, what we're finding is people would recommend their team, but not the organization as a whole. And that has a really big impact on the employee experience. The main theme to celebrate from all of the EMPS analysis that we went through was there's a really high value placed on the flexibility and smart working. So lots of organizations are able to offer things such as working from home or having flexible working structures. That's a major benefit to employees. And that's one of the key reasons why they'd consider recommending their workplace. Now, we appreciate that that might not be available to all types of organizations, but where it can be offered, it's incredibly valued. Then when looking at things around improvements, the excessive workload and high levels of stress is the key thing that would stop people recommending their organization. linking into things such as burnout, stress, poor work-life balance. These are the things that are massively impacting how an employer or an employee thinks about their workplace. So in terms of a theme to celebrate, one of the comments that we had was the main sell when recommending is the smart working and working from home flexibility. As we talked about, that's really high value. This is something that I thought was really interesting looking at the comments here. The experience is amazing, but the workload and the pressure are something else. I wouldn't recommend it to someone I care about. Imagine being an employee and being in that mindset. Really high levels of workload, really high levels of pressure, to such a point that people you care about you wouldn't recommend. That says a huge amount. One of the things that we have within our platform is key driver analysis. So any of our customers on the call, you'll be familiar with this. But earlier on in the presentation, I talked about how do we help organizations make really impactful change and build really impactful action plans. So not necessarily just looking at what was our lowest scoring area and now we need to focus in on that, but really looking at where are the areas that the changes we make can have the biggest impact. So the purpose of the key driver is to look at the relationship between questions within surveys. So where people score particularly well for example, the ENPS score, where else did they score well? That can give us a real insight for what's going to be impactful and how organizations can drive change. The major benefits here is that you can start to prioritize efforts and resources in the most appropriate place, helping you really factor and understand the areas of your business that are going to move that needle. Enhancing decision making. Again, it starts to provide a really data-driven insights approach to making better decisions. So rather than relying on assumptions, you can be really confident in the decisions that you're making and building those people strategies based on evidence. Then when we come into the deeper understanding of employee behavior, the key driver analysis, that goes beyond just asking them what's important. It allows us to really identify those underlying factors that influence behavior and perceptions. It, it uncovers what we call hidden drivers, so providing a more accurate picture of what really motivates your employees. So when we looked at the poll, one of the really big things that stood out there was about how do we demonstrate the impact of culture on the performance of the business. These are things that you can start to talk about, and the key driver will help to deliver that. So in terms of the results, the key drivers of happiness, no surprise, as we saw a lot of this coming up earlier, feeling inspired, feeling valued, and trust were all down. But we know they're really important drivers of happiness, yet they're coming down. Key drivers of engagement, again, feeling inspired, feeling valued, same as in the happiness area. But being kept informed is a really important driver of engagement. And we've talked a lot today about the importance of having that proactive communication. When I was looking at these results, what I thought was really interesting was number one, there's some crossover between the drivers of happiness and engagement. But I saw that as a real positive because that means that by focusing on these right areas, such as inspiring your people, making them feel valued, is going to boost both happiness and engagement, really accentuating how valuable they are as drivers of happiness and engagement. What really hit home was also these are the things that employees are telling us through the data are really, really important. Yet they have all significantly fallen recently, more so than a number of other areas within the cultural assessment. So it gives us a really good understanding of what are the things that we should be focusing in on, but also by boosting people feeling inspired, people feeling valued, building trust, and people feeling that they're kept informed. That will have a massive impact on the overall happiness and engagement of employees. So we're just coming to the end of the time here, but in summary, it's a tough working environment. I think it's something that we should acknowledge. Doesn't mean that we can explain everything that's happening within our organizations around that, but it's certainly something that we should be acknowledging. Overall cultural assessment scores are down, as we saw earlier, driven by happiness and engagement, which are both down. The things we've just talked about in terms of the key drivers of happiness and engagement, they have fallen. But that's really good because that allows us to understand that because the same things that drive happiness and engagement are the same, we can find initiatives to help boost that, give us a little bit more bang for our buck there. But the ultimate thing here, this is all data we've aggregated together. And this data can be really powerful, really insightful. But getting this data on your own employees is even more powerful. So if you haven't used the happiness index before, what we have is we allow you to benchmark your organization for free using our software. You can use the QR code here now, and that will take you through to a web page. That web page allows you to sign up for it. But then you can start to see, well, some of these terms we've used, such as clarity, enablement, etc. How does your organization compare against that? Where do you sit in the benchmark? It could be a really valuable exercise for a lot of you on the call here.
Perfect.
So that kind of draws us to a close for today. I don't think we've got some time now, David. So I'll pass back to you. And if we've got any questions, I'll be really happy to answer them.
Yeah, we do. That's great, Tony. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. As Tony mentioned, we've got a bit of time for some questions. So if you want to pick Tony's brains on anything or anything stood out, do type them into the Q&A panel on your screen. I've had a few come through already. First, I mean, just a couple of housekeeping points. One person's asked what date is this data from? So it might be that you missed the start of the presentation. So this is the 12 months to the end of May this year and being compared with the same period a year earlier, just for clarity. Had a question about will we share the report with everyone? Yep, again, absolutely. So after this webinar, as part of our follow-up, we'll share a PDF of the presentation that Tony's taking you through. We'll also share a recording of the session as well if you want any clarity or want to share that with anybody internally, that's absolutely fine. First question that's come through is more of an observation, actually. There was somebody said it's sad to see that communication is poor and the reduction in access to resources. So yeah, it's absolutely correct observation. I think it's particularly interesting given that there has been a bit of an uptick in companies requiring their staff to come in and work from the office at least a few times per week, often 3 or more times per week. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Tony.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend that we're seeing more and more around people kind of returning to the office. Kind of feels very 2022 type conversation there, doesn't it? About people returning back into the office. But I think it's about getting the right blend and being able to offer the flexibility where you can. We saw how valuable that was for people. In terms of the resources, again, having a centralized office may allow you to have better resources that could be shared as well. So, yes, I think having that communication is really important, but really being clear on why are we asking people to come back more into the office? Are we just doing that because we feel it's the right thing to do as as an organization? Is that the right thing for you to do? Being really clear on that purpose. Billing them as things like collaboration days. So at the Happiness Index, we've got one tomorrow where we've got our employees coming into our office. We bill that as a collaboration day. That's not a day for everybody to come in and sit on their laptops and just work away as normal. That's a day for let's get some meetings booked in. What are the things that we want to do face to face? Let's be really clear about the purpose for that. Then people won't necessarily see that as, oh, I could have done that working from home. But if I was working from home, could have dropped the kids off, could have picked them up from the school run. And the flexibility that that offers is something that's really valuable. So having that clear purpose and really communicating that can make a massive difference.
Great, thank you. So one of the attendees has raised their hand. So Emily, that's you. I'm going to select an option to allow you to talk. If you're comfortable to do so, if you've got a question for us, if you want to speak now, you might need to unmute yourself first. Or it might possibly be a bit of a misclick. So Emily, just in case it was a misclick, I'll move on to another question that's been asked via the chat. Someone's asked, have we started to see the impact of AI in any of our stats or feedback?
Yes, in terms of the comment analysis. So we're starting to see that coming through. What we are seeing is an enabler rather than a replacer, if that makes sense. So when people are talking about resources that they have available, having access to AI is something that they're talking more openly about. So as an example, at the Happiness Index, we use Google as our kind of work suite. Others will use things like Office 365. Within Google, you have Gemini, which is built into a lot of products. Microsoft, they have Copilot. There's a number of others, ChatGPT, etc. That's absolutely something that we're seeing more of as a rise in people talking around that. Where we are seeing it being used incredibly well are things such as work-life balance. So being able to help people accelerate the level of work, not necessarily replacing somebody, but just meaning you can do a task a bit quicker, being a little bit more productive with that. Where we see AI and the best use cases of it is where it can help you shortcut a task and the output might be 70, 80% of what you would be happy with. Then it's about the individual using their skills, their knowledge, their expertise overlaid on top of that. Massive dangers around just taking an output from AI and replicating that and using that. There should always be that human filter. That's something that we are actively encouraging our people to do. We want people to be using AI. We want them to be doing it responsibly. We have an AI policy that allows people to understand what they can, can't do, etc. We've given guidance around that. So absolutely, we are seeing more use of that within the data, more examples of that within our data. I would also always, whenever talking about AI, just caveat that piece around the human involvement, the skills, the expertise. Just because it's come from AI doesn't mean it's better than a human output. And I think sometimes people are naturally very trusting. Oh, it must be right because AI said it. But actually, what can you add to it as well?
Yeah, and I think also, not that I've got any data to back this up, so it's very speculative, but some of the concerns that you mentioned earlier, Tony, around, say, job security and meaning and purpose, I think AI, even if it's not being mentioned explicitly, AI is bound to be having an impact in those areas too. So when it comes to meaning and purpose, for example, if I speak from sort of the area that I'm experienced in marketing,
Yep.
you could imagine up until this point in your career, someone in marketing might really enjoy the process of writing a blog post, writing an article, coming up with witty, interesting social media posts. And now AI can do that pretty damn well.
Yep.
But your job is no longer the content creator; it's the AI prompter and corrector, and it's a different experience. And it might be for the person in that role much less attractive, much less interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that AI, as it's being introduced into organizations, is evolving all of the time. The way in which we use it, the impact it's having on people,
Hmm.
absolutely will continue to evolve. But again, that bit about the meaning and purpose, how do you inject your personality into that? You mentioned how do you create that witty remark? How do you get that? Look at ways in which you can use it as a basis and therefore then go and add your flair on top of that. And I think being able to communicate that openly within organizations is really, really important.
Right. Thank you. Um, Someone said a lot of the reasons given are being driven by macro events. So, what, if anything, should a company be doing to communicate or change things for their employees when that's the case?
So I think it's, as we've talked about there, it's about being open and being honest, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, being able to be proactive with that. Part of kind of a leader's role. So if I talk about my role as I talked about being the managing director, but also as a co-founder of the company, I kind of have some different hats on as well. One of the things that myself and Matt talk about a lot is what's happening in the kind of macro environment and how does that impact us? How do we respond to that? What are the
Mm.
things that we need to be thinking about? What are the things that we need to be communicating to people? What are the things that we believe people have been hearing, and do they have some concerns around that? I'm a firm believer that you can't control kind of the macro environment as an individual or even as a company. However, it's your responsibility to be able to respond to that in whichever way works for your organization.
Yeah, so it's always better to know. It means that you can be in control of the narrative. And let's be honest, your employees are not stupid. They'll know. They'll know if the job market's a little bit shaky. They'll know if
Yeah,
sales are not where they were last year or behind target, or perhaps major customers are leaving. They'll know about that. And maybe that also ties back to I think a comment you made earlier, Tony, as well, about it's easier for the rumor mill to start now. I think when it was being very closely managed whilst nearly everybody was working from home a few years
yeah,
ago. Now that people are just having those chance meetings with people in the lift or wherever it is, those sorts of rumors are a lot easier to start and spread than they were a few years ago.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, look, they're all the questions that have come through. So thank you everyone for putting those in. They're great, great set of questions. Tony, thank you for your stats and your presentation. It was brilliant, absolutely fascinating.
My
Like I said
pleasure.
earlier on, we will share a copy of the recording and slides with everybody. If you have any other questions that come to mind after this session's ended, just drop us an email and we'll reply and respond as best we can. So, Tony, many thanks, everyone on the call. Thank you.